As soon as someone finds out I'm an architect, the first question is always, what kind of architecture do you do?
Worked with a lot of creative people, pretty famous ones, Kanye West, Virgil Abloh. Is that something that works particularly well, this relationship you're talking about, when you're working sort of artist with artist?
They know they wanted to build something, but what, where, how, they have no idea. And that's an easy in for us to say, okay, we can not only guide you, but actually talk about why do you want to do a piece of architecture in the first place? We look at it like every piece of architecture is in some way a cultural project. The only example I could think of where there wasn't a building ask was actually Plus Pool, which was like the almost very first prototype I came up with. Could we find a way to create an architecture like this ground up, not through like your classical top-down route? One of our board members who had been supporting the project for like 2 or 3 years suddenly was like, wait, it filters water? And I was like, you, we've been trying to tell you this for years. Like, how are you not paying attention? And then I realized, I was like, oh, he just likes it because it's cool. And he's been giving us tens of thousands of dollars and like working all this pool just because he thinks it's cool looking, even if he didn't know it filtered water. You're like, this is a goofy looking pool. Look, I guarantee you, if it was not a plus shape, we would not be here right now. And I think there's something that architects can learn, which is actually don't be afraid of a kind of personalization in the work. Weirdly, the more hyper local the work gets, the more global appeal it seems to have.
Why do you think it matters for a building to capture the feel of its immediate neighborhood?
It's important that a building captures maybe a local culture, but that isn't necessarily how the architecture oftentimes feels. I think you should have like a good reason to look how it looks in relation to what's there previously and what the local kind of architecture is. But I think there's plenty of examples where a departure from an existing aesthetic or material or form is actually really useful. You know, that a lot of our work in the offices in Chinatown, I wouldn't say that as we're working in Chinatown, we want it to look like classically Chinatown as an example. But there's certainly, I think it's really important to work hyper locally, even if it doesn't necessarily look like something you'd seen before.
Can you walk us through an example of maybe a project in your office where you had to navigate this threshold?
Actually, we're working on one right now that's pretty interesting, which is with Pierre Sirot, who's one of the 3 founders of Ghetto Gastro. And it's a series of projects, but the first one is for what's called a culinary design studio. And it's all in Barbados. So it's a combination of restaurant, test kitchen, design studio, a little bit of residence. I'm probably pretty obviously not from Barbados. And so almost entirely the culture, the existing typology of architecture, the priorities of what's down there is me having to receive information, both from Pierre, from locals, just from observation. And so that's a pretty typical way that we start a project is, again, just going down there and listening and kind of being very patient and watching and observing and not really jumping into design right away. It's super important to be there in person. I think being there in person always makes such a huge difference between just kind of like online research. But once we get a first sort of like inkling of an idea after a period of sort of observing, we then move really hyperactively into design. And it's really quick outputting sketches and models and really rough, undeveloped ideas. And the reason for that is twofold. One is I think we're trying to tap into a kind of intuitive reaction to things. I think there's just as much relevance in a lot of ways, for example, into my own cultural knowledge and kind of upbringing as there is in the things that I've observed on any local site, and trying to bring that combination is really key. The other side to move really fast is, again, we get to put stuff in front of someone like Pierre or a client or a community and get in a reaction or get feedback as soon as possible, well before we have any kind of formalized, concretized design. And then that process kind of just bounces back and forth while slowly kind of we narrow down both in scale and refinement and detail. And it kind of slides into, at that point, sort of a more traditional architectural process.
You talk about this really intimate relationship you have with your clients. I think that probably distinguishes the type of work that you do from others. But is that something that someone can expect from most architectural relationships, whether they're on the client side or if they're an architect serving somebody?
Yes, I guess there's a certain level of intimacy, I would say, with whoever is representing the client side on the other side of the table. A lot of our projects, for example, the client is really just the person who's started, founded, is the face behind, is the entire reason a brand or a project or a culture really exists in terms of what we're working with. And so that intimacy is really direct, where all of that person's, say, hopes and dreams, but basically all of that person's kind of like ambitions of what they're trying to do with this piece of architecture is relayed really directly. Other times, you're working with a project manager or someone representing a larger client body, and that intimacy is really hard to, there's an intimacy in the person, but there's really hard to tap into an intimacy of the organization, let's say, you're designing for.
Right. Some of the conversations we've had so far is, especially talking about your work, Dongping, is how architecture can serve as sort of a cultural vehicle. It seems like this relationship, this intimacy we're talking about, is really about translating that culture that maybe has been cultivated by the client in their own work outside of architecture into some sort of physical object. Now, my question, and I think also a question that many people who might have if they're not coming from an architectural background is, has architecture always served as that cultural vehicle? And maybe what are the opportunities and limitations when that is kind of the agenda for the architecture firm?
I think short answer to the first question is yes. Even if it's not intentionally serving as a cultural vehicle, I kind of feel like, I mean, there's plenty of examples where the architecture is very deliberately a milestone or a concretization of a certain set of cultural values. Governmental buildings, museum buildings, which I feel like oftentimes are like there to cement a certain reading of history or prioritize, let's say, a certain type of art, for example. Those are pretty direct. But even your everyday residential project or office project, for example, which I don't think most people consider as a cultural project, just by default, I think are holding tons of cultural value. I don't mean value in like good or bad. I just mean like what we as a society deem worthwhile as cultural value. And so I feel like every piece of architecture is in some way, I mean, we look at it like every piece of architecture is in some way a cultural project. I think being more conscious about how we're shaping and highlighting certain aspects of a certain culture is really exciting in the work. And to your point, I think a lot of the really intimate moments we have with clients are with clients that are themselves trying to push a certain push kind of new cultures or emerging cultures or trying something different from the cultures that they're a part of. I think that's usually the most exciting groundwork that we have to start any kind of work.
Can you tell us a little bit about like what's different in the way that you practice versus what we would consider traditional architecture practice?
I don't know. I don't know if I've worked. I was like trying to think of the last time I worked in a traditional architecture practice. It's probably been about 15 years. Actually, you know what? Thinking about it, one way might be that intimacy side. We started working a lot with clients, for example, just through like WhatsApp or just on the texting. And that informality, I've noticed, has actually shaped not only like our speed of a project and our process and communication, but does shape, I think, even how we design at some point. And I would say traditionally, it's much more of a structured, you know, you get a brief, you get a program table, you get a budget, and then the architect retreats, comes up with a certain level of design, brings it back to the table, and you refine. Generally, how we work is, even if there is a structured schedule, obviously, it's much more fluid in terms of communication. And so with the best projects, there's oftentimes a moment where like I actually don't remember or can't really tell where the whole idea came from. I can pick certain points and I can say like, okay, we decided that material, we brought that to the client, we went forward with it. But there's a lot of projects where I'm like, I actually could not tell you if this was, oh, I couldn't rationally say this was our idea purely. I couldn't also say that it's necessarily the client's idea either. And so there's a really nice like blend or weird ambiguity because there's been so much information back and forth, references back and forth, sketches back and forth. I hadn't really seen that in traditional offices that I worked with, where there's so much fluidity between our side and the client side and the consultant side. And that's something I really enjoy. And I think really, especially when oftentimes we're working with a client, again, especially if they're kind of like pushing a certain aspect of culture there, where architecture is really a step that they haven't taken yet. This is oftentimes the first project. And so the architectural representation of what they're trying to do is as exploratory for them as it is for us, or vice versa. So even as we show them something, they're suddenly going to have a different notion of what they're trying to do in return with an idea. And the only way I think to keep that really pushing is to move really fluidly back and forth a lot.
You've worked with a lot of creative people, pretty famous ones, Kanye West, Virgil Abloh. Is that something that works particularly well, this relationship you're talking about, when you're working sort of artist with artist as opposed to client and service provider?
Yeah, very much, very much. I think there's an inherent way of communicating when you're working with another creative person or an artist. It's much more open. There's also an assumption that if I provide an idea, that it's not really just going to get accepted or rejected. It's going to come back with another version of that idea. And then so it really builds on itself. Versus a service provider is really just like, have we satisfied the needs that you set out at the beginning of this week or this month or this phase, and certainly for the project. And it's there's less building on itself in terms of creativity.
Does it get hectic though? It sounds like you have to be very involved.
Yeah. So our office is pretty small. The largest we've ever been is 12. We average around like 6 to 8 people. And one of the main reasons for that is we only take on about 4 projects at a time. And that's mainly to be able, especially for me and also the people on the team, to be really deeply invested in each project, which just means deeply invested in the relationships with the people that we're working with. Without that, I don't know how we would take on like 50 projects at a time and keep up that ability of hecticness.
Is this something you think can scale?
Yeah, I think less of an interest in scaling. Like, for example, right now, those kind of personal relationships are almost entirely through me. I'm the one on the WhatsApp. I'm the one kind of establishing relationships, which obviously limits the amount of on like active relationships. I can only date so many people at once, basically, through projects. And also, like, it means that there's a very specific point of view to the work, which is, in this case, mine plus whoever we're talking to. One of the things I've been exploring in the office is trying to find ways where what would typically be like a project lead in the office, I'm starting to call them like directors, very similar to like a film or a film production studio, where there's a director on the project who really has a lot more autonomy in terms of running that relationship. In an ideal world, it's even that the director and the client have had a relationship that then forms this project that us as an umbrella company can help steward. In other cases, you sort of like matchmake and see if there's a relationship there. The nice thing with that is I think there's always a slightly different angle to how the design will turn out, the priorities of the conversations. But of course, like the studio as food will then still have oversight to make sure it's kind of satisfying, again, everything that the client wants and the reason they approached us in the first place. That model is something that um, I'm trying to figure out how to formalize. And again, I think that the film production studio is probably the closest example of that I can think of. And so we've been calling it internally an architectural production studio. And the idea is that there is not project teams, but almost like mini studios within where there's a director. We form a team around that director, and that team and our production studio has an ability to take on projects from very early on, from financing to strategy to even the idea of why you'd even do a building in the first place through the architectural construction and even like post construction. So openings of a building, first year of programming, all the sales and marketing of it, the press around it. I think it gives us more agency, but also if that structure works out well, then it does allow us to have more of these conversations at once.
I want to reflect on this a little bit because it sounds to me, when you're talking about this type of stuff, it reminds me a lot about content creation in the modern era. Like, people are making culture through digital media mostly that they can produce by themselves. Yet when they start to scale it, it becomes more like a full-on production studio as well. No question here exactly, but I just want to throw that out there as a sort of corollary because I don't think, the three of us are architects. When we grew up and we were trained, sort of like the end game was you go work for this big architecture company, and whenever someone needs a big building, they go to them and they produce it and that comes out. But it seems like, to run the type of firm that you're running, you need to be much more like ingrained in society in a way, and you need to be much more responsive to things that change and trends and things of that nature.
Yeah, I think that's also just out of self-interest. Classically, as soon as someone finds out I'm an architect, the first question is always, "What kind of architecture do you do?" And I don't have a good answer for that in a way that's probably detrimental, but it's also kind of intentional that I've always tried to do a really diverse set of work, and that's purely again out of self-interest, where I did not want to just only personally get interested in high-end residential, let's say, or in a very narrow facet of culture, certainly not in like architectural culture as a profession. And so the interest are then into fashion, into music, into art, into environment, into like materials or whatever it might be. And to your point, I like that you're saying like once you get ingrained in those kind of different avenues, you start meeting people, you start developing ideas of work you could do together and understanding what kind of priorities those aspects of culture may have. Different than sort of setting up, we do XYZ really well, come to us when you want XYZ done. So I think it's a much more, the hope is we can make it a much more proactive version of an architecture office where we're actually, if not pitching, we're actually part of the generation of even an idea that will then lead to a building.
Right, like the producer role, right? And if you were to take the film corollary, like you see the idea and you start to get it enacted.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. We started a project yet where there wasn't already a thought for a building. Like there's a number of clients, or I should say partners, where they may have a building, they don't know what to do with it, or They know they wanted to build something, but what, where, how, they have no idea. And so that's an easy in for us to say, okay, we can not only guide you, but actually talk about why do you want to do a piece of architecture in the first place. The only example I could think of where there wasn't a building ask was actually Plus Pool, which was like the almost very first project I ever came up with at this point 15 years ago, where nobody was asking for anything like that. And the idea of something built seemed nice. It seemed like a good idea. And so that was very much almost like a production project where how do you out of thin air create a viable pitch for an architecture.
Yeah, can you walk us through that project? I think it's something that a lot of people associate your name with.
So Plus Pool is basically an Olympic-sized plus-shaped swimming pool. It floats in the East River, and the trick about it is it's meant to filter river water through the walls of the pool. So basically functions like a giant strainer. And so I actually patented a filtration system that produces clean water that's cleaner, or certainly as clean as any public chlorinated pool. And then that water gets filtered again as it moves back into the river. So the intent anyway was for the first time in over 100 years that people could literally swim in clean East River water.
I recently was searching swimming in the East River because I was wondering if anybody has swum in the East River, and no one really has. It doesn't seem very safe, but Plus Pool came up as like, this is going to be able to happen. But the videos are from 5-10 years ago. You know, what's been going on with the project? How did it start? And then how do we end up where we are right now?
It is insane that it started, technically 2009 is when I had the idea for it, but basically 15 years ago. And it kind of started out of a desperation of wanting to do interesting work, but at that point having no clue, no connections, no money, no kind of client contact, be like, hey, hire me to design you a floating swimming pool. That wasn't happening. And so really it was like, let me just invent something, make a design. Because if any skill set that I picked up in school, it was like, I can make really good looking designs. I can make good looking renderings. I can make good looking drawings, good looking diagrams. I don't know how to build anything, but I can communicate like an attractive design and a compelling thing. So I did that and basically created what looked like a convincing base. It was almost like I did what AI does now, but it took me much longer. Like I remember like walking across, I guess it would be the Manhattan Bridge, walking across the Manhattan Bridge, seeing the cove in Dumbo and be like, oh, this is a really nice view, taking the photo and then figuring out what to put into the view. And that rendering became like the foundation of this project for a good decade, where all the fundraising was happening off of it. It was in all the press. It kind of like launched the project and moved it forward. But basically the really accelerated version is like putting it out in the world, suddenly getting a lot of interest in press. It's like, what is this? Is this real? Is this a thing? And then really learning on the fly of, okay, now that we have interest, what the hell do we do with this? We did some crowdfunding. We were approached by Arup Engineering they donated their time at the beginning and basically developed the engineering and filtration around this project to the point where we got the interest of the city, formed a nonprofit, just kind of kept developing it. The intent of the project originally was also, could we find a way to create an architecture like this ground up, not through like your classical top-down route, not through a developer route, not through like a city initiative or an RFQ route. By the time we got to around 2019, 2020, it had so much success optically that it kind of got subsumed back into, I would say, a more traditional structure of getting a project like this done, which was at that point the kind of nonprofit highline structure of things. And so then that started attracting the money, it started attracting kind of governmental agencies. And once it started doing that, then I think it became much more familiar the mechanism was more familiar to agencies in the city. It's like, oh, okay, this is how we run it through the mayor's office. This is how we get certain agencies involved. This is how we fundraise around it. And that slowly unlocked things like the site, like the testing. Now it's in a prototyping phase where a piece is getting built to put in the river for swimming. Like all these things were planned, frankly, almost a decade ago, but it took a while for it to become, it took a while for, I think, people to believe that it was a real viable thing, even though it was a really exciting thing. And then now it's kind of moving through those gears.
So what was it that changed people's perspective that finally made this project real for them?
I think there were really two main milestones. Three main milestones. The first was just that first image. Obviously, at that point, nobody had even seen the project like this, but I was surprised how impactful that first rendering was. And I remember as we were forming the nonprofit around it, one of our board members who had been supporting the project for like 2 or 3 years suddenly was like, wait, it filters water? And I was like, fuck you. We've been trying to tell you this for years. Like, how are you not paying attention? And then I realized, I was like, oh, he just likes it because it's cool looking. And he's been giving us tens of thousands of dollars and like working all this cool just because he thinks it's cool looking. And that's actually kind of amazing. Like purely from this like one image he was bought in. Like it's interesting even now that people are like, what's plus pool? And then I'll show them the image. They're like, that, like I've seen that. Like everybody, or so many people I should say, not everybody, is like familiar with that image. So that was like milestone 1. I think milestone 2 was getting a patent for the filtration, or to a point where like, look, we're not just kind of like casually testing this filtration. We've actually developed it to a point where we can legitimately stand behind it. We have data to prove it. And that was a much more like long slog. It wasn't like a light switch moment like the rendering was. It was like, look, here's 3 years of testing. Here's data. Here's like all this stuff. But it was funny when people see like a patent drawing, like you look at an iPhone and you understand like the squiggly line patent drawing. Just having that kind of document legitimized 3-4 years of water quality testing we were doing. The last thing was getting a site, because we were siteless for so long. I wanted it to go over to Brooklyn Bridge Park originally just because it's really beautiful there. We're working with them for about 5 years, and eventually we were siteless. That didn't work out. We did a site study for 2 years, and then this was during de Blasio administration. They approached us and said, do you want to go to 2 bridges? And I don't think we'd even considered the site they were suggesting, which is right off of Pier 35, basically right north of where the Manhattan Bridge comes over. And that was the first time we had any city or governmental approval for a site. It still took a couple of years to actually get the legitimate approval. But once we had a site, we could then start showing it in a real location. We could start talking about it with a neighborhood or with a site in mind. And I think that was a big milestone. It's like, oh, they're not literally just kind of floating around as an idea. They actually have a real place to work with now. That also unlocked a lot of like the technical work, is now we can actually work with the seabed. We can work with the connection upland. We can work with the neighborhood. And that was a big deal. I think the funny part is that came about almost not for any effort, frankly, of us. It was purely political, that de Blasio was getting so much shit for allowing this really high-end luxury tower to come into 2 bridges. That he basically needed a win. And they said, look, we need a win. This thing's really friendly. People like this. Would you want to go there? And we took advantage of that.
Yeah, that's the value you provide there. You can help make people's lives easier, both to swim in the East River, but also maybe get some votes or take some pressure off.
Yeah, get some votes, for better or worse, like soften the blow of some terrible developments. And
it's interesting.
So it went from this like idea, right? This image, and you've proven out the technology, and then now you have a site. So has the plus pool, the idea, changed throughout all these phases to what it is now, or has it remained pretty faithful to that original idea?
It has surprisingly remained pretty faithful. I mean, obviously the tech has developed quite a bit, but the general idea, the look of it, the shape of it, the design of it, except in detail, has really stayed surprisingly. And when I say surprisingly faithful, it's because I expected it to morph. I think that the only reason it didn't, which is something also like took a lot of like I learned a lot from, was we basically, the design was put out before any conversation around it. So there was a really clear intent. And from that point on, people can either love it, they can hate it, they can comment on it. But there was enough support behind it where instead of adjusting the design to meet certain demands, we just would adjust the demands to meet the design. Or we'd engineer our way around it. Or we'd like, look, we can't go to sites 5, 6, 7 because frankly it just doesn't fit there, as opposed to saying, how do you fit it into a site? And the argument was always, look, it has to be. I remember there were a number of developers or interested parties that were like, we would love to do this, but a plus doesn't make any sense for the site for us. Why does it need to be a shape? And I remember saying, I was like, look, I guarantee you, if it was not a plus shape, we would not be here right now. Not to say that the plus shape at all was the best design for it. It actually causes a lot of problems, but it had to be weird looking. It had to be iconic looking. It had to catch your attention. Again, even if you didn't know it filtered water, you're like, this is a goofy looking pool. And that was really, really key for it to continue.
Were other mathematical symbols on the table, or was it plus?
No, it was plus from day one.
The square root pool.
The square root pool. I mean, there was talks of, there was a lot of sites, for example, that didn't have the size of site. So we were looking at a line, we're like, we could just call it minus pool and try to keep the branding together. But it wasn't quite the same. No, the plus, I don't honestly know why the plus came about, but it was day one. I think when I thought of it, I was like, it'd be funny to have a plus shape thing. You know, it's a very familiar shape, but a shape that you haven't ever seen floating in the middle of a river. So that was really important for me.
I don't want this to sound pejorative, but there's a certain like attractiveness to the packaging of the project. And up until now, since it's not realized yet, it's basically become like content, right? It's like cultural content that people know about but isn't there yet. And I think it sort of speaks to our day and age where to break through the noise, you need to have something that is very clear and legible, like the plus. It's alliterative, like plus pool sounds nice. And it's something that you can kind of like imagine it even without knowing what the project is. What I want to ask you about next is like, is that something that most architecture can take on, or is it only these specific types of maybe civic projects or maybe small scale projects or things that are working with certain brands that can do? Because it feels like to have that impact, you need that you need that je ne sais quoi, I don't know what it is, that special sauce that packages the thing in the right way.
I mean, you need a hook, basically.
Yeah,
and I don't see any reason why it can't be applied to any scale of project. I think that the sticky point is most architects, and I will say including myself, like I'm still getting better at it, are just really bad at that. We're not trained or not particularly good at communicating things. Mm-hmm. When you see certain really successful architects, I'm thinking of like a Foster or a Biarca, where it's almost beyond whether the designs are good or not. They're just incredible salespeople. And I think they're more traditional salesmen. But the analogy that I was thinking as you were laying that out was music now, for example, the first time I'll hear a piece of music oftentimes is a 10-second hook in the background of a TikTok video. And you'll hear it over and over and over again. And eventually you'll make your way to the full song. You will never really make your way to the full album, but you'll hear most of the song and then it becomes like a streamed thing. But that hook is so key. And I think part of the reason a lot of architects, or we're so bad at it generally, is architecture is a very complex thing. It's a really complicated thing, both technically and culturally, whatever. And I think we revel in that. It's really hard for us to distill that down to a really digestible, welcome thing, both out of our own pride and I think just have the difficulty of reducing it. And so I knew that I needed that for Plus Pool because I was like, there's no way people are going to give a shit about this unless you see it for a split second and you remember it. So that was really important. I also just love, like branding, logos, kind of pop music. I'm like a huge like pop person. I think for those reasons, it's really interesting to see what catches and what rides through like a zeitgeist. But I wouldn't say it's something that us as architects are particularly well trained at doing.
So it's interesting, I think, Plus Pool as a project, because when you look at it, it can really exist anywhere, right? Any major city with a body of water can probably accommodate some version of Plus Pool. But at the beginning of this conversation, we talked a lot about embeddedness, locality, kind of the local context and culture. For you, do you envision Plus Pool as a local project? And if so, like what's local about it?
I think the point was it's very much a New York project that they can then, once Pool 1 is built, you can go ahead. What's funny is like, I don't know, what's local about it? I would say what's local about it is, one, there is an embedded stereotype within New York City about swimming in the East River. Like there's a Seinfeld episode about it. There's a universal like recoil if people are even considering swimming in the East River. And that actually works really nicely for this story. For example, like if I propose this in Copenhagen or somewhere where people are actively already in the body of water, or there's a government that's like willing to clean the water for you, this probably wouldn't seem that exciting nearly as we're trying to do in New York. The other thing, as dumb as it is, it's like that classic, like if you can do it here, you can do it anywhere. I think part of that is because it's so stupidly difficult to do something like this in New York. It's a really conservative city when it comes to doing new kind of construction. The machinations, again, that we talked about is like you're either dealing with a billionaire or you're not getting this done kind of like machinations.
Were there other cities or other municipalities that approached you and say, hey, like we want a Plus Pool?
Yeah, like over, the decade, I remember talking like it was Berlin, London, Paris, Baltimore, Sydney. I'm sure there's a bunch that I'm not even thinking of. But as you can imagine, like almost every major city is on a body of water of some kind. More and more, almost every major city has contaminated that body of water. And so there's certainly like a use for it. What's interesting though, looking back, is I don't think any city approached us and said, we want to do this first. It's a very New York American mentality to say, we're going to be the first to do this, which also I think fed into what, like when it first caught press wind, the summer that it was launched, I remember someone told me who was writing about it, like, this happened because New Yorkers love talking about New York. I think if New Yorkers had seen this again in even LA, frankly, they'd be like, whatever. But certainly if it was like not in the US, And so there's a certain kind of arrogance and pride and kind of like blind faith that, yeah, we can pull this off. 15 years later, I mean, this would have probably been done faster if it was not in New York, but I think it's really important still that like, look, this has to happen in New York first, at least in this version of it.
Yeah, to me, it represents a sort of urban transformation, which New York tends to, like you're saying, Dongping Wang, whether it's true or not, they tend to think that, it's at the top of. I think that's sort of quite New York in itself, regardless of a style or it's a sort of like aesthetic or anything like that.
Yeah, there's a nice global assumption that New York is still pretty progressive. It's a nice brand that I think plays well for us. I don't think it's necessarily true, but it works well for this is like a very like American invention kind of thing coming out of New York City.
How are you going to measure the success of Plus Pool once it's built?
I have no idea. I'll try to think through a lot. I mean, a lot of it's like fairly just kind of informational, like the economics around it, the usership around it, how many swimmers are we getting through there any given summer. I think there's a lot of numerical things you can measure. Obviously, like the one risk for Plus Pool is no matter what we do, people are not going to be willing to swim in East River water. I personally don't think that's a huge risk because frankly, there's so many people in New York and the pool can only hold a couple hundred. So there's going to be plenty of people that are willing to try this. And once you see other people try it, I think that stigma will be gone. I think the success around Plus Pool, for me anyway, will actually be more how does it impact the immediate neighborhood it's in? And how does it then impact how New Yorkers in general think about the water that surrounds the city? So like a big transformational moment for me was at some point looking at the East River and realizing, like I grew up in San Diego, I grew up surfing, but when I came up with Plus Pool, I actually lived closer to a natural body of water, the East River, than I'd ever had in my entire life. But it certainly didn't feel that way. It wasn't like I'm like going to the beach all the time here. But once I realized that, I was like, oh, that natural body of water, why do I just look at it as something that you take a bridge over or take the subway under? It is never something I even consider like touching, let alone jumping in. And so that kind of like rolled into, well, how do we, it'd be nice to change that because it's really hot sometimes in the city. And I was like, if that psychology can change, if we can use the ability to get people into the East River through Plus Pool to change the psychology of the city and the inhabitants of the city, to me, that's really the only way where we'll change environmentally how we tackle things like polluting our rivers, even larger climate change issues, is that there's a visceral desire for it, not just like a moral imperative. If Plus Pool can even like advance that even in a small way, in my mind, that's a really good marker of success. I don't know how you measure that, but they might just be seeing like more policy changes or other pools popping up.
We mentioned at the beginning of the show, you're working, for instance, with individuals, especially artists and creative types on smaller scale, more intimate projects. You also have Plus Pool working at kind of the urban scale. Is there an in-between scale that you're interested in working at? Something that's maybe more community-based or more local, but not necessarily at the scale of the city?
I guess what would that scale be? A scale of a building? Well, so we're doing right now, it's like we have very, very intimate projects, which are the scale of like an event. It's not even like architecture in a classic sense. In that regard, it's kind of like, Libo, your question of like post-occupancy, it's kind of like we're working, like this is Mahjong Club basically that I'm talking about. We started a Mahjong Club in the office in 2021 and basically have turned it into a kind of like side project that we've run, I think 11 times now. And basically the idea is to basically produce a Mahjong event. We design out the space, we do the music and find people to do the food, have good partners for that. But it is kind of like, okay, are we able to, in a really lightweight way, create a space that people simply just want to spend time in and come to? We can design that in really heavy-handed ways. We can design it in really large-scale architectural ways. But end of the day, do people actually want to come here and stay here and continue to come back? So that is a really small, intimate scale is something that we've been pushing the last couple of years. To your point, there's a large city scale that's still really, really interesting to me. There's a big intersection in Chinatown, for example, that's always been backburning in the office of what to do with this large intersection in Chinatown. And so that's more almost like planning scale. At the medium scale, I don't know, Alex, if those are what you're suggesting, but to me, that's kind of just like the scale of like a building. Something smaller than a block, but bigger than a single space or like a part of a building. And we're starting to do projects at that scale, which is nice because they have a kind of impact that's larger than like an interiors project, but not as not as complex or long-winded as, let's say, a planning project.
Well, what I think is interesting is just like the architect is, again, to keep on going back to this trope, and you seem to be breaking these boundaries. Like the architect is not relegated to one type of building, one time frame, one product type, for instance. That, in the case of Mahjong Club, it's not necessarily a building, it's more like staging an event, but it's still about bringing people in the same space and curating that space to be fun, entertaining, interesting, which also at this moment when, there's a lot of friction between the way we spend our days digitally versus physically, it seems like there's more need for some of that, and maybe some of the sort of architecture can help facilitate that on a more frequent scale. But then, of course, then we talk about plus pool and it's like 10 years of regulation and trying to figure it out, but then maybe you have a nice, well-endowed patron and they can do something really quickly on their private estate or something at a different level. I think that sounds really amazing. And I'm sure you probably learn a lot from those different types of interactions.
A really direct point that I learned from was when we were working with Virgil, is that he was so insanely prolific, like nonstop with production of things at a lot of scale, like oftentimes at a product scale, but architectural scale, digital scales. And it never seemed incongruous with what he was trying to do. Even though you were like, how the fuck did he suddenly like design a water bottle? How is he now like doing an event? How is he like DJing in 5 different cities at once? But it all kind of seemed like a singular project of sorts, where the body of work ultimately, it was all a body of work ultimately to kind of, I think, my read was to push what he saw as like a really important project for being like a Black creative, for being a designer in his status, to actually like touching on everything from like the local kid up to like, the LVMH world. And I feel like that's a really nice way to look at it, where even the architecture, whatever scale you want to discuss it at, is really just kind of a tool to push a kind of like cultural creation. And sometimes the tool you need is really intimate, sometimes the tool you need is really large. And so I think the foundational intent is actually always pretty similar across whatever scales we're working at. Oftentimes the bigger ones just require a lot more people to work on it and a lot more expertise that we don't have inherently. But the interest, weirdly, it doesn't ever feel, the scale issue has never felt overwhelming or out of bounds for me, for whatever reason. And I think it's because there's like a cultural interest there that can apply to a lot of different scales.
Maybe let me ask a you-focused question. I think throughout this conversation, one thing that I really admire is your seemingly willingness to kind of go on a journey, whether that's realizing an idea in the bureaucracy that is New York City, or going on this co-creative journey to help a client figure out what the architectural expression of their idea could be. What is the Dongping Wang stamp on a project? Like, how do you make a project distinctly yours?
I don't think. Which might be a problem. It usually presents itself as a problem from like a sales, like recurring marketing point of view, because I find it probably hard to like identify like that's a food predator, that's a Dongping Wang project. The only thing with projects that I work on is simply that I'm really deeply involved with them. And so there has to be some kind of like inherent consistency to it, even if it doesn't show up aesthetically. I don't think there's an aesthetic or architectural like tectonic stamp. More recently, and this was probably like starting in like 2017, 18, I kind of realized like my personal project was basically almost like designing what Asian American architecture was, for myself anyway, because obviously there's a lot of variations that could be. And I realized that was not only an interest, but as I got more into it, I think it was a really, it kept building on itself, because in my mind, the Asian American identity is still pretty nascent. Aesthetically, it's either very limited or there really isn't really an understanding of what Asian Americanness looks like from an aesthetic point of view, in the same way that there are for other cultures. And so I was like, oh, there's an infinite amount of work and exploration and journey, like you said, that could be done here. And then you're up against, okay, well, what does that look like when you're doing a project in Barbados? Because there's no need for like an Asian American architecture in Barbados. But there is a kind of connection in terms of exploring a cultural identity that hasn't really been concretized yet, especially in a contemporary form. So I think that there's a lot of overlap between what I'm personally really excited to explore and interested in exploring, and what a lot of partners and collaborators that I work with are exploring. But I don't know if there's this like an architectural stamp. I feel like someone else is gonna have to tell me that if they see a consistency.
Just put your whole body of work into a segmentation algorithm.
Yeah, we'll see what comes out. There is one like the sketches I do are pretty um what's the word? Pretty familiar across projects, but they're not like baked into everything. I feel like I need to like put those out.
So I think as we, round towards the end of our conversation, you've dropped a lot of great learnings on us in this conversation, but I think there's two that I want to ask. One is, what lesson from other creative fields do you feel like architects should borrow?
This is probably because I've done a lot of work with um, fashion designers and fashion brands. What I've learned anyway from working with, especially people like Virgil, with Kanye, with a good friend Raul here who has a brand named Loire, is fashion moves so fast and there's so much of it in a way that in order to keep up and stand out, I think you have to tap into something that's very personal to you. The brands that I think are doing the most interesting work, you can see that there's like a really inherent personal connection to who they are as a person, where they came from, the communities that they're a part of, and the actual clothing, the fabrics, the designs, the patterns, the cuts, the colors that they put out there. Like those reference points oftentimes are very direct as soon as you see them. You're like, oh shit, that's like obvious right there. And I think there's something that architects can learn, which is actually don't be afraid of a kind of personalization in the work, and what we talked about before, like a kind of locality in neighborhood or in community that does require you, I think, to be part of a community or communities, which weirdly feels a little bit antithetical to how we were trained. I think a lot of times architects are trained in a kind of like international style or a kind of like community list way of approaching work that's a little bit agnostic of like personal specificity.
You put all the deadlines on the party weekend, so you can't have any
Seriously,
non-architect
you have
friends.
no socializing. We don't know how to talk to people. But I think that's something that was like, I feel like we could benefit a lot from as a practice is a little bit working fast, at least in initial ideas, but working in much more personal, intimate ways that connect to maybe a smaller community, but then actually branch to much larger concerns beyond your local.
On that note, do you consider yourself a local architect or a global architect?
More and more, I consider myself a local architect, even like a Chinatown architect, like not even specifically a New York architect. And I think the only reason I'm comfortable now with that is because of how global aspects of what we do really locally seem to apply. Like they seem to work pretty globally. Weirdly, the more hyper local the work gets, the more global appeal it seems to have. And I think a lot of that's like, it both stands out in a certain way because you're seeing, your feed is littered with international things from all over the world. So I think things need to stand out a little bit. But again, it's also allows me to tap into like really specific veins of thought, culture, emergence in other places that share a similar ambition, even though the reference points and the histories are very, very different.
Right, and probably amplify it to a certain extent. Things that are happening that
Yeah,
don't have a chance to surface
totally.
on the internet, if you can architecturalize it, if you can physicalize it and make it something larger and more visible, then that has more currency across global society.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I do kind of think the idea of being a global architect just doesn't feel like, certainly I want to keep working all around the world, both for just personal interest. And I think it's like really exciting to be able to import or export, I guess, like ideas that are formulated here elsewhere. But somehow the idea of like a global architect from a philosophical point of view doesn't sound specific enough to be interesting anymore.
Well, as the local architect, maybe this is something that you can teach our listeners. What would be something that, someone who doesn't know a lot of buildings can maybe learn or intuit that will make them appreciate the buildings around them a little bit more?
I only think about this because my fiance laughs at me every time I do this, and I think a lot of architects probably do this. Is like looking up at a ceiling. So like I'll walk into a place a lot and be like, oh. So I feel like ceilings are really neglected, and ceilings I feel like tell us a lot about the priorities of a space. If they're really beautiful, then it tells you that like the entire kind of holistic environment was really thought through. Oftentimes they're purely functional or kind of leftover, and again, it tells you a certain set of values and priorities. But also it just kind of forces you to pause a little bit because it's very hard to like look straight up and keep walking and kind of look at a certain detail in a certain corner. It's probably too much to ask to then have people then try to imagine how that impacts your daily life, whatever ceiling detail you see. Yeah, that is a really simple thing you can do. Even when you're walking through the city, sometimes you forget to look up and you realize, oh shit, these buildings are really tall. Or I didn't realize that there's this like crazy detail, like 40 floors in the air, or all of the life that's happening off of the ground floor is really interesting. Like we're sitting in this, I think, on the 23rd floor right now. Like all of this life happening in layers of the above the city is super fascinating. But it's very easy to like not look beyond your eye line.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always with my friends and like they're always like, you're always looking up, you're always looking up below. Like, how did you notice that stuff? I was like, well, it's kind of my job now, but but it does change your perspective. I think that's one of the nice things about even just training as an architect is you look at the world differently and you notice where that attention and that detail has gone into it.
Yeah. And especially, I think, as you start looking at details and kind of different moves, and this is probably from the architectural training, and you're like, oh, that detail over the door or where that AC vent is placed and how that's shaped, or that light over there, how does that not only affect the comfort in the space, how people move through the space, but also suddenly realizing that's tied into like a whole system of things happening in the building. And that the building is actually like a very active participant in our lives. It's not just a passive shell that we live within, but it's affecting us in ways that are constant. And so I think you forget that they happen. And that's as a trained architect, it's really, I mean, I'm sure you guys are the same. It's like nice to sometimes like, oh, that's why I'm so unhappy in this space, or that's why this space feels really good, or that's why I'm like happy to have lunch here, or that's why I'm suddenly somehow like moving to that corner of the building, or I avoid this street. Oftentimes it's the kind of like environment that the architecture is creating.
As someone who is very in touch with the cultural zeitgeist, if you can imagine 30 years from now, when you look back on this time, how would you describe the moment that we're in?
I'm looking at this in a really excited, optimistic way. I think we're going to look back and see a power shift away from the West, or I think we're in it right now, away from the US. My sense right now is there's a lot of hanging on to what we once had. And so that results in a lot of violence, results in a lot of bigotry. And I think it's kind of a natural shift towards either the East or just somewhere not in the US. And to me, that's actually really exciting. I think by the time it actually happens, I'll probably be pretty irrelevant in culture. So hopefully I just get to enjoy it at that point. But it does make the current work also interesting because it feels like we're going through it right now. And it's oftentimes really hard to actively work in that shift when almost like global power and global culture is shifting or slowly moving. Especially when you're day to day, you're like, I just need to get paid and like do a job. But maybe 30 years. I think in 30 years you'll see it. I'm so curious what will happen with the architectural industry in regards to that. Like even the last 10 years, seeing, I think we might have talked about this in the kind of intro call we had, but seeing how people consume architecture, which was once kind of project by project or even office by office, and now it's image by image. You know, it's the same thing of like we used to listen to albums, now we listen to 10-second clips. I think that that's going to keep evolving in some ways. So even how people understand architecture is going to be quite different in 30 years and probably really fast. But I think generally we're in a very like transitional moment, which I think is probably going to get worse before it gets better. But optimistically, I think it'll be really healthy, hopefully in 30 years, hopefully less. It's time for something new.
Fantastic. This is a very unique response to that question. We get all over the place, but I like that one.
That's why we're excited for this one. Well, again, thank you, Dumping Wong, for this wonderful conversation. I'm sure our listeners enjoyed it a lot. I know Alex and I both did. If people want to find out more about you, more about food, where should they go?
The website is food-arch.com. You can also just DM me Instagram. It's just Dongping Wong. Those are probably the two easiest places. You'll see the office email on the website, but DM and I'll try to reply. I actually really like, there's a lot of kind of ongoing conversations, especially with students and young architects, which is always like very enjoyable for me.
And when can we swim in Plus Pool?
It's perpetually 4 years away, but it's been 4 years away for probably like 10 years. So let's be optimistic and say 3 years from now. We'll push it down a year and say 3 years from now.